The wind came down from the north on a Thursday in late October, the kind that didn't whistle so much as groan, low and continuous, like something in pain. It drove the snow in from Lake Manitoba in long horizontal sheets, and by the time dusk settled over the homesteads west of Culver Creek, the road between town and the outlying farms had become something closer to a guess than a route. Boyd Fenwick didn't mind storms. He'd grown up in them, homesteaded through them, lost his wife to the aftermath of one. Not the blizzard itself, but the pneumonia that followed. The February she'd spent nursing a neighbor's family through fever and come home soaked through and already fading. That was 6 years ago. He'd stopped minding the storms when he stopped minding much of anything that happened above ground. He was stringing the rope line from the barn to the house, the same rope, the same rusted iron hooks. His wife Meredith had made him install the first autumn they arrived, when the lantern swung and caught something pale in the ditch beside the fence line. He thought at first it was a dog. Then the pale shape moved. Nessa Colquhoun had made it 3 miles from the edge of Culver Creek before the storm turned serious. She had 17 cents in her coat pocket, a carpet bag with most of her sewing needles and one change of clothes, and no horse. She'd sold the one she came with to pay 2 months' rent in advance on the room above the dry goods, back when she thought she was staying, back when she believed a town in need of a seamstress might be willing to take a woman at her word. She hadn't known about Arlo Beek then, hadn't known that the general store owner's nephew had a habit of borrowing from the till, and a particular gift for pointing fingers, hadn't known that the $40 missing from the cash drawer would, by the following Monday morning, have her name on it in every conversation in town. 3 weeks, that was all she'd had in Culver Creek. The ditch came up faster than she expected in the dark, and then the frozen ground came up faster still. And then everything was cold and very quiet. Boyd pulled her out by the shoulders and knew 2 things immediately. She was breathing, and she'd been out there long enough for her hands to go the wrong color. He didn't stop to ask questions. He wrapped his coat around her, over her own wet one, got her arm over his shoulders, and walked her back to the house the way he'd learned to move through a storm. Slow, deliberate, eyes on the rope. Inside, he set her near the stove and brought the fire up fast. Then he checked her hands and feet with the same methodical attention he gave a sick animal. No drama, no wasted motion, just work. Her boots had soaked through. He removed them. Her fingers were white at the tips and red at the knuckles. He held her hands between his palms and breathed on them slowly, the way his father had taught him during his first winter on the homestead, before his father understood that the boy had figured out how to keep himself alive just fine. She made a sound at some point, not words, just a sound that meant something was waking up, which was good. By the time she was fully conscious, Boyd had wrapped her feet in dry wool, put water on the stove to warm, and gone to sit at the far end of the kitchen table, with a harness strap he'd been meaning to mend. He didn't hover. He sat and waited. "Where?" she started. "Fenwick Homestead," he said. "West of Culver Creek, 3 miles. You went into the ditch." She looked at her hands, wrapped in flannel he'd had drying since morning. "You pulled me out." "Yes." She studied him. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that could have been 40 or 60 and you wouldn't know for certain. Hair dark except at the temples. He sat very still, the harness strap forgotten in his hands. "I'm Nessa Colquhoun," she said, watching for the recognition she'd learned in 3 weeks to expect. "Boyd Fenwick." He got up and poured the warm water into a mug. "Drink this first, talk after." She stayed 3 days because of the blizzard, and a 4th because her left foot swelled in a way that made walking uncertain, and Boyd had simply not offered her any option besides the settle bed near the stove. He wasn't a man who said much. She understood that on the first morning. She'd woken before dawn to hear him moving in the barn. And when she sat up, there was already a mug of coffee on the table. No knock, no note, no performance of the gesture. Just the coffee, still hot. On the second day, she asked to help. He handed her a pile of wool socks that needed darning without a word, which she was beginning to understand was his version of saying yes. She watched him work. He moved through the house and barn with a precision that wasn't efficiency so much as habit. Everything in its place, every task at the same hour each day. Small signs of Meredith were everywhere. A pattern of embroidered flowers on the window curtain that didn't match the rest of the room. A good china teacup on the shelf he never lifted down. A hook by the kitchen door with nothing on it. The hook bothered her somehow. It was the only empty thing in the house. On the third afternoon, she found her scissors case on the windowsill. The leather had been cracked along the spine since September, and she'd been careful with it, holding it closed by habit. Someone had oiled it. The crack had been pressed back together and stitched with a thick, waxed thread, the kind used on harness work. The stitching was smaller and neater than it needed to be. She picked it up and held it for a moment and didn't say anything when Boyd came in from outside, and he didn't say anything either. "What? You were married," she said that evening. Boyd set down the harness he was cleaning. "Meredith, 6 years gone." "I'm sorry." He picked the harness back up. It was a long time ago. It wasn't, she thought. Not the way he'd said her name, careful, like a word he still handled with both hands. It was on the 5th day that she told him about Culver Creek. She hadn't planned to. She wasn't a woman who explained herself, but there was something about the way he listened. Without leaning forward, without the sounds of sympathy people made when they were really only waiting for their turn to speak. That made the telling easier than she'd expected. She told him about the $40, about Arlo Beek, about arriving in town 6 weeks after her brother Daniel had died in a logging camp near Thunder Bay, which meant she had no family to write a letter of introduction, no congregation who knew her face, no one to say she was the kind of woman she was, just herself and her needles and the horse she'd had to sell. She told him how the town had decided, quietly, without a meeting, without anyone saying anything directly to her face, that a woman arriving alone without backing was the likelier candidate for a theft than the store owner's nephew, who at least had the advantage of being known. Boyd listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You were leaving on foot," he said, "in that storm." "I was trying to." "Where to?" She hadn't thought that far. She said so. He nodded once, like he understood more from that answer than from everything else she'd told him. He stood up from the table. "You can stay until your foot's right." She looked at him. "You don't know if I did it." "No," he said, "I don't." He went to bank the stove for the night. "But you darned every sock I own and you made the coffee this morning without being asked. I'll take the risk." She almost smiled. She hadn't done that in 3 weeks. By the time Nessa was walking without a limp, Culver Creek had had 4 days to talk. Boyd came back from town one afternoon, with flour and salt and a length of dark blue wool he set on the table beside the supplies without explanation. "I don't need charity," she said. "It's not charity. Perkins at the mill owed me 2 weeks of fence work. He doesn't carry cash. He had cloth." Boyd looked at the fabric. "I don't have use for it." She didn't entirely believe him, but she took it. "What are they saying?" she asked. He pulled out a chair. "Dorinda Falk says, you came out here because there's no other place that'll have you. Says I'm either foolish or I'm getting something out of the arrangement." Nessa set down the cloth. Her jaw tightened with that particular clench she'd developed over the past 3 weeks. "And what did you say?" "I didn't say anything," Boyd said. "I bought the flour and left." "Silence looks like guilt." "Silence looks like a man not interested in what Dorinda Falk thinks," he said. "Same thing maybe, but I can sleep on mine." She stayed. She didn't make a formal decision about it. She simply found, each morning, that leaving made less sense than staying, and Boyd didn't push her in either direction. She set up her sewing at the kitchen table and sent word through Reverend Sloane's wife, Blythe, that she was taking commission work. Blythe Sloane was a small, sharp-eyed woman who had formed her opinion of Nessa within 5 minutes of meeting her and found it favorable. "Don't trouble yourself about Dorinda," Blythe told her one afternoon, sitting across the kitchen table while Nessa pinned a hem. "She's been telling people what to think since before I married into this congregation, and she's not always wrong, but she's not always right either. And most folks here have figured out the difference." "She has an audience," Nessa said. "She has a voice," Blythe said. "You have hands. We'll see which one matters come spring." That evening, Boyd came in from the field to find Nessa at the table. With Blythe Sloane's dress spread flat, her scissors moving through the seam the way a confident person moves through a room. No hesitation, no wasted gesture. She didn't look up. He watched her for a moment from the doorway without meaning to. She had a way of being present in a space without asking anything from it. He'd forgotten that quality existed. He hadn't known he'd missed it. On the second Sunday after the storm, Boyd drove Nessa into town for the morning service, because she said she was going. And he wasn't going to let her walk 3 miles in November. He didn't go inside himself. He hadn't sat in that church since Meredith's funeral. But he waited with the wagon on the street, watching the horses at the hitching rail, doing nothing in particular. He heard it from Blythe before the congregation had dispersed. She came outside and found him and explained quietly that Dorinda Falk had waited until the final hymn. She had a way of choosing her moments and made a remark loud enough for 6 pews to hear. Something about charitable people who took in troubled women and whether the trouble followed them wherever they went. Boyd got down from the wagon. He walked into the church. The floor creaked under his boots. People turned. Nessa was standing near the back, coat already buttoned, holding herself in the way he'd learned to recognize. Very straight, very still, not a single muscle giving anything away. Dorinda Falk was still speaking. Something about community standards and what people owed each other. Boyd walked up the aisle and stopped beside Nessa. "Nessa Colquhoun has been in my home for 2 weeks, he said. His voice didn't rise. "She has paid her way with work and given me no cause for doubt. No one in this room has offered anything more than hearsay about her, and I'd think twice before calling that evidence." Dorinda's chin went up. "Some would say it's your judgment that's in question." "Some would," Boyd said. "You can add it to the list of my business that isn't yours." He turned and opened the door and held it. Nessa walked through with her head up. Outside, she didn't speak for a moment. They walked to the wagon. He helped her up, climbed up beside her, picked up the reins. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "I know. It'll make things harder for you. Probably." The horse moved forward, down the main street, past the general store, where Arlo Beek's face appeared briefly in the window and disappeared. "Why?" Nessa asked. Boyd thought for a moment. "Because what she said wasn't true. And I don't see the point of letting untrue things stand." Nessa looked at the road ahead. Her hands were folded in her lap. "It's going to be a long winter," she said. "If you keep making enemies on my account." "I've had long winters," he said. 3 days later, Arlo Beek left Culver Creek in the night. He took the stage to Brandon without telling his aunt, and he left behind $23 in the general store till. Not the full 40, but what he had left. 2 men from the feed warehouse had seen him do it and told Reverend Sloane, who told Clifford Beek, who was a decent man and not interested in stopping being one on his nephew's behalf. Nessa heard the news on Saturday, when Blythe Sloane arrived with a fruitcake and enough commission orders to keep her through February. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after Blythe left. looking at the name she'd written on the first order slip. Colquhoun. N. Culver Creek, and thinking about what it meant to have her name mean something ordinary again. Boyd came in from outside and looked at her face. "Good news," he said. "Arlo Beek is gone." His uncle confirmed the money was his. "All right. It means I'm clear." She looked up. "It means I could leave." He went to the stove and put the kettle on. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "You could," he said finally. "Boyd." He turned around. "I've been trying to figure out," she said carefully, "whether I'd be staying because things have changed, or because leaving frightens me." He looked at her with that steadiness she'd stopped finding unsettling. "And," he said, "I think it's both. I think both things can be true at once." He nodded slowly. "Usually are." She folded her hands on the table. "You should know. I'm not easy to have around, I don't." She stopped. "I don't make things simple." "I know that," he said. "People will still talk." "Nessa." He said her name the way he said things he'd already made up his mind about. "People talked about me for 2 years after Meredith died. Said I should sell up, go back east, that a man alone on that much land was either stubborn or broken." He paused. "I'm still here." "Why?" she asked. "Because it was mine," he said. "Because I built it, and she helped me build it, and the fact that it got hard didn't change what it was." She understood then that he wasn't only talking about the land. "I'm not Meredith," she said quietly, not as a warning, as a fact she needed to set plainly between them. "No," he said. "You're Nessa Colquhoun, and I haven't been confused about that once since I pulled you out of that ditch." She looked at him. "Some people would say you're too old for me. Some people say a lot of things. Some would say I've got a ruined name, and a man with a good farm and a good reputation shouldn't tie himself to that. I've heard those arguments. And—" He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face. Not breaking open, not anything dramatic, just a door shifting on its hinges. "I've spent 6 years being very careful," he said. "Careful about what I hoped for. Careful about what I let myself want." He looked at her directly. "You make me not want to be careful." The kettle began to hiss. "That frightens me," he said. "In case you thought I was easy about this." "I didn't think that," she said. He poured the tea and set the mug in front of her and sat down across the table. The lamp was low between them, the light moving slightly in the draft from the window. "If you stay," he said, "it won't be because things have changed in town, and it's practical. I won't let it be that." "What will it be?" she asked. He looked at her with that particular attention. Steady, unhurried, the look of a man who had already arrived at a decision and was simply stating it aloud. "Because I want you here," he said. "Not as a boarder, not as someone who owes me anything." She was quiet. Outside, the wind had come back. Not violent, just present. The kind of Manitoba November that settled in for months and made the world smaller and the fire more necessary. "I don't know how to be wanted like that," she said finally, "without earning it or explaining myself or I've been justifying myself to someone for so long I don't know how to stop." "I know," he said. "I've watched you apologize for taking up space twice a day since you got here." She laughed, a short sound, startled out of her. "You don't have to earn it," he said. "That's the whole point of it." She looked at the mug, then at him. "I'd want to keep my work, my sewing, my own income." "I know. I'd want to be direct with you, even when it's uncomfortable. I've noticed. I'm not going to become someone easier just because." "Nessa," gentle but certain, "I know who I'm talking to." The lamp flickered. Outside, the first snow of December had begun, soft this time, the kind that came down in silence, laying itself over the fields without asking permission. She wrapped both hands around the mug. "All right," she said. He nodded once, the way he settled any matter that was decided. Winter came fully to Culver Creek, and with it the slow, unannounced work of two people building something in close quarters, not without friction, not without the occasional silence that sat wrong between them until one of them found the words to move it, but with a steadiness that looked, from the outside, less like falling, and more like two people arriving somewhere both had been trying to find for a long time. Blythe Sloan came out regularly with orders, and then her sister, and then the doctor's wife, and by February Nessa had more work than ours. She sewed at the kitchen table and spread her lengths of cloth on the settle bed when she needed room. And Boyd quietly routed his morning work around her patterns without being asked. He built her a proper shelf for her thread, nothing elaborate, just pine boards and square nails, but at the right height and in the right light, and said nothing about it once it was up. Dorinda Falk made one more attempt in February at the general store. She said something within earshot of several people about what respectable households looked like and what they didn't. Clifford Beek, who was still running the store and still ashamed of his nephew, looked at her across the counter and said, very quietly, "Dorinda, I believe you've said enough." That was the last of it. On the first Sunday in March, Boyd drove Nessa to the service and went inside. He sat beside her in the third row and sang the hymns in the low, barely audible voice of a man who remembered the words but had lost the practice. Blythe Sloan caught Nessa's eye from 2 rows forward and smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had expected this outcome and was glad to be right. After the service, Clifford Beek shook Nessa's hand in the yard and said he hoped she'd accept his apology. She accepted it simply, without making it more than it was. On the drive home, the fields on both sides of the road were still deep in snow but beginning to hollow at the south-facing banks. The first faint suggestion of a thaw that was still weeks away. Boyd was quiet for the first mile in his usual way, not absent, just settled. "You went inside," Nessa said. "Yes. You haven't done that in 6 years." "No." He looked at the road ahead, seemed like it was time. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The land didn't change that spring. The fields were the same fields. The fence lines ran where they'd always run. The rope from the barn to the house still hung on its iron hooks, the same hooks Meredith had asked for, and Boyd had never taken down, and he didn't take them down now either. But he stopped stringing the rope each October, with his head bent in the way of a man performing a duty alone, and started doing it in the company of someone who handed him the line without being asked and understood, without explanation, what it was for. When the snow pulled back, and the first geese came loud and low over the creek, there were 2 people on the porch in the early morning, watching them go over. The house was no longer quiet in the way that empty things are quiet. It was quiet the way full things are quiet, because they don't need to announce themselves to know they're real.